So without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Jones, who will talk for maybe 45 minutes to introduce the book, and should leave plenty of time, about the same at least, for Q&A at the end. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. That's very kind. You haven't heard what I want to say yet, so... As a proud Yorkshireman, it's very nice to be back in the north and to be in the second best county in England. So thank you very much, Andrew, for that introduction and for inviting me, and thanks for coming along today, and thanks to those joining online. This book came out very late last year. The research was completed just before the first COVID lockdown, so it is a lockdown book. And to make a start, to give you a sense of the book and what its arguments are, I'll start with this little vignette. And this vignette is about China's record on non-proliferation, the global non-proliferation regime for nuclear weapons. Now, ostensibly, China has sided with the status quo powers on this question. And this is part of a wider debate about whether China is a status quo-oriented power or it is a revisionist power, committed to international norms or committed to overthrowing those norms. On non-proliferation, it looks like China is siding with the established regime rather than its local ally. It has supported tightening sanctions on North Korea since 2006 at the United Nations, and it also seems to have implemented some bilateral sanctions of its own, in the sense that it has excluded North Korea from the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's not a member of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank either. However, at the same time, Chinese investment in North Korea has risen considerably over this time period, and so too have North Korean exports to China. So it seems that at the same time that China is supporting widening sanctions, it seems to be providing an economic lifeline to North Korea that has undermined those sanctions. Local authorities have periodically eased tourism and trade restrictions, and so the US says China is undermining this sanctions regime, it's undermining the non-proliferation regime. President Trump tweeting that China had been caught red-handed undermining UN sanctions. Now, how do we make sense of such inconsistent behaviour? On the one hand, it seems to be, Beijing seems to be a status quo power, on the other hand, it seems to be a revisionist power that's undermining international law. Now, that is difficult to do from the perspective of international relations theory in the rising power debate. This debate about what is the impact of rising powers like China, Brazil, Russia, and so on international order. The reason why it's difficult for IR scholars is that although the unitary actor model, the idea that states are these sort of billiard ball, rational actors, strategically doing what is in their own self-interest, although that idea, that model of the state, has been relaxed in international relations more broadly, and certainly with respect to international political economy, in the rising powers debate, that assumption is still very strong. The assumption is that China is doing one thing or another. So what do we do when we're confronted with evidence that it seems to be doing both at the same time? What actually happens in practice is you get cherry picking and shoehorning. So you get liberals and realists, for example, the main two protagonists in this debate, they will pick the evidence that suits their theoretical interpretation, and they'll tend to ignore or downplay the others. So for realists, they would say, look at the way that China is undermining this regime. It's a revisionist power. This is part of China's grand strategy, is deliberately undermining this regime, undermining UN sanctions, to maintain a friendly regime in a neighbouring country as a buffer against the United States. This is part of China's grand strategy. Liberals, on the other hand, they would say, well, there might be some minor compliance issues here, but generally speaking, China is behaving as a status quo power. it's propping up the non-proliferation regime. They would play up the cooperative side. And so because there is evidence, even within this small vignette, there is evidence on both sides, that debate over rising powers has become deadlocked. Different theorists just pick the evidence that suits their own perspective and beat each other over the head with that evidence. But the debate doesn't go anywhere. And so increasingly it becomes speculative. Okay, well, maybe there's a bit of evidence on both sides, but in the future, China will do X. And that basically involves projecting your theoretical proclivities into the future. If you're a realist and you think that great powers tend to challenge one another, you would expect China to challenge the United States in the future. If you're a liberal and you think that institutions generally constrain and blah, blah, you would expect that in the future. So therefore, the debate becomes increasingly speculative. What we're trying to do in this book is intervene in that debate and move it past this impasse. And the way that we do it, to give a flavour of how we might do it, what's going on in this particular vignette? Close empirical work has shown that this non-compliance with sanctions on the Chinese part is not driven by some kind of careful, cunning strategy from Beijing. In fact, sanctions busting is driven by local level actors in the Chinese party state and in the economy. It's Chinese firms, it's Chinese provincial governments in the province bordering North Korea that are the ones that are undermining sanctions. Beijing often doesn't know that this is happening and is caught flat-footed when news of these violations comes to light. And often Beijing has to react to these violations as they're made clear. So, our argument in Fractured China is this. China's international engagements often exhibit inconsistent or even contradictory behaviour because China today is not a unitary international actor. Decades of state transformation involving the fragmentation, decentralization and internationalization of party-state apparatuses mean that many Chinese actors, with often differing interests and agendas, now operate internationally with considerable autonomy and limited coordination and oversight. This produces agendas that do not necessarily reflect top leaders' agendas, which may themselves be unclear. Now, what we are doing in this book is trying to bridge a significant gap in the literature between experts who write on China, sinologists on the one hand, and IR theorists writing about rising powers and international order on the other. On the left-hand side, you can see some classic works in the tradition of sinology. And in sinology, the dominant consensus since the 1980s, since the late 1980s, has been that China is no longer this kind of monolithic state where all the decisions are taken at the top. The dominant paradigm is fragmented authoritarianism. And some sinologists began tentatively to look at what that might mean for China's foreign affairs, what this fragmentation of the internal party state might mean for Chinese foreign policy. On the other hand, on the right-hand side of the screen, what you can see is some traditional, kind of quite typical texts in IR theory. I mean, you could produce hundreds of these images focused on Chinese grand strategy. And in some of these texts, there is this remarkable emphasis on China's long-term strategic planning. So on the one hand, what you will find in the sinological literature is the idea that China is now quite a fractured state, quite fragmented, not very well coordinated, all kinds of difficulties in making things happen, in pulling things together, all kinds of contradictions and problems. And when it comes to China's foreign affairs, the writing is about grand strategy. It's about a strategically calculating unit that is engaged in a long-term strategy. So long-term, it's a secret strategy, which somehow people know about, which is a century long. That implies a capacity for long-term strategic planning and implementation that is beyond the capacity of Western states, for sure. And I think sometimes there's a kind of tone of envy in the way that Western elites and observers talk about China. Look at the Chinese. They're so well organized, they're so strategic, while we're flailing around in the Middle East and blundering into war with Russia. And this is not some kind of peripheral view at all. Rush Doshi, whose book came out more or less the same time as ours, funnily enough, is a member of the National Security Council. So this is a very entrenched view. There's clearly a disjuncture here between the way that China experts think about China and the way that IR people, particularly those close to government, particularly the American government, think about China. Now, why is that? Why is there this disconnect? It represents a failure on both sides. For sinologists, the difficulty is that China is a big country. There's lots of ways you can study China, and there's so many people working on China that you can write for other China specialists. You can just publish in China journals, and you don't really have to use theory very much. You don't have to develop a comparative approach. And even if you want to communicate your understanding of China as a fragmented authoritarian actor, what frameworks do you have available to communicate those findings to international relations experts? IR theory does not provide you with any theoretical frameworks capable of plugging in this information. And that is because, as I mentioned earlier, there is this strong unitary actor assumption in IR theory, which has only been relaxed partially. And certainly when it comes to questions of geopolitics and international order and rising powers, that assumption remains very strong. And theory that tries to tie domestic developments to international behaviour is relatively weakly developed and not very appropriate when it comes to what we're talking about here. So if you take foreign policy analysis, for example, there are schools of thought in foreign policy analysis that try to understand foreign policy as the result of domestic processes, the most obvious one being bureaucratic politics. The bureaucratic politics model, which says that different agencies bargain and struggle with one another to generate foreign policy. But the idea of that theory is that that bureaucratic politics process resolves itself into an authoritative decision that then results in foreign policy behaviour. And what you will see throughout this presentation is that it doesn't work like that. This bargaining and contestation process marks the whole of the policy process, all the way from policy formation through to policy implementation. And also, even the most advanced versions of foreign policy analysis do not take account of the internal fragmentation of states under globalization. What we try to do in this book is to develop and apply the state transformation approach, which is a approach to understanding international affairs that we have developed in our previous work. And here we develop it and apply it to the rise of China. The foundation of this approach is Gramscian state theory. Gramscian state theory does not understand the state as a unit, as an actor. It understands it as a conflict-ridden ensemble of institutions that reflect struggles within society, embedded in broader political economy dynamics. Now, from this perspective, the state is not necessarily unitary. In fact, it's usually disunited in different ways, because states reflect divisions within their broader societies and power struggles within their broader societies. And so the attempt to cohere states, to pull them together, to make them express some kind of national consciousness, to impose upon them some idea of the national interest, to cohere the state behind a particular agenda, that is a political task, it's a project, and it's not always successful. In fact, it's frequently not very successful. But you must study that process of trying to cohere and unite the state, rather than just taking it for granted in the Gramscian tradition. Now, Also from this perspective, what's going on in China is not sui generis. It's not unique to China. And that's another area where sinologists often falter, because they focus a lot on the reform and opening up process since the 1980s. But they treat that as if it's somehow some kind of unique process, which is not. That the changes that have happened in China since the late 1970s are part of a generalized worldwide shift. The fragmentation of previously relatively coherent states into much less coherent states, attendant on changes in the global political economy, what we call globalization. So there are things that there are local instantiations of this general trend, but it is a general trend. In China, the specific detail is, of course, the shift from Maoist state socialism to capitalism, and the shifting class basis of the Chinese party state away from the peasantry and the proletariat towards an emerging cadre capitalist class, the fusion of business and officialdom in China, which is a very disunited, fragmentary, competitive social class. And this is associated with three different vectors of transformation in the Chinese party state. First of all, fragmentation. This means the dispersion of responsibility, power, authority, lawmaking, resources, etc., regulatory power, the dispersion of all those things across different agencies operating at a single tier of government. So dozens of different agencies involved in a particular issue area, with often overlapping, contradictory, confused mandates, and lack of clarity about who's really in charge. The second vector of transformation is decentralization. So the devolution of power, resources, authority to subnational governments. Particularly important for our purposes is that the provincial governments in China have been granted control over their foreign economic relations, and that has led provincial governments to pursue their own sort of foreign policies, to conclude treaties with foreign governments as far afield as Africa, for example. And then the final vector of transformation is internationalization. And this denotes the transformation of agencies that were originally created purely for domestic purposes into international actors. The most obvious of these are state-owned enterprises. These were formerly ministries, production ministries, or businesses that were created for the development of the Chinese economy. Now they've become global actors and implementers of Chinese development financing, the Belt and Road, and so on. They're often seen as just arms of the party state, but actually they've become corporatized, quasi-autonomous, profit-seeking actors. But there are many other actors, from police units to domestic coast guards, various different functional ministries that now have international departments and have international relationships with their counterparts in other countries. Now, this is all quite well understood in sinology, but we're trying also to theorize this and to create a framework through which we can understand, well, okay, given these changes in the party state, how then does China's international behavior work? And the question that we try to answer is, how is power now exercised in the party state? And that, again, is a significant shift from the questions that people tend to ask in sinology. The question in sinology is often, how fragmented is Chinese authoritarianism? And how much power is at the center? How much power is at the periphery? How much power is at the national level? How much power at the local level? And we just track that back and forth. That is not an unimportant question, but what we're interested in is, well, how does power actually get exercised? How is policy made? What shapes Chinese behavior? And we theorize a shift from a command and control structure of authority in China, where detailed decisions about who should do what and why and when and so on are taken at the center and then driven down to the local level, and there is very little room for maneuver within that system, to what we call a Chinese-style regulatory state. In the regulatory state, and again, this is a general concept, it's not specific to China. In a regulatory state, the central executive is no longer involved in that kind of positive intervention, where we say you do this, 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 and this, with very little room for maneuver, and you do this, and you do that, and you do that, and I'll give you that resources to do this, and so on and so forth. In the regulatory state, the executives tend to retreat from that kind of role, and instead to regulate the behaviour of a whole host of different actors, public, private, and hybrid actors, that sets out broad policy goals, broad ideas, broad directions of travel, guidelines, regulations, and so on. But then it is for other actors to decide what that means in practice. They're given considerable leeway to determine what these things actually mean. And this shift from command and control style state to the regulatory state, as I mentioned, is a general shift. And I've written, for example, about the failures of Britain's governance of the pandemic as an example of the failure of this regulatory state form in the context of the UK. But obviously, there are local specificities. So China, at the centre, there are various regulatory mechanisms that are used to coordinate and steer these different actors, these fractured actors within the party state, that are not present in Western-style regulatory states, for example. And there are 5 main ways in which the centre sets out the broad direction of travel and tries to coordinate and steer different actors. The first is party ideology or ideological campaigns. The second is top leaders' statements or slogans, which Jing Han has written extensively and compellingly about. The third is various kinds of forms of committees that bring agencies together within a particular policy area, leading small groups of the State Council or of the Politburo and party commissions. These are attempts to bring together these fractured different agencies and to try to create a broad agreement amongst them. But often these interests are just reconciled within broad frameworks rather than any particular interest being decisively prioritised over others. There is, of course, the centre's control over laws, regulations, and funding. Chinese laws are often incredibly vague and permit all kinds of forms of behaviour. They're not very tightly specified. But if you want a new law, if you want more money for a particular project or whatever, then you may have to go to the centre for these. And if you go to the centre, you're going to have to present what you want as being consistent with what the centre seems to want. So that also creates constraints on just how far you can go off-piste. And finally, the most important mechanism that the Chinese-style regulatory state has is the Communist Party itself, particularly its control over the appointment of officials. The centre still controls, I think, around 4,000 senior appointments in the country, although the appointment to other more junior posts is decentralised. The appraisal system, the cadre responsibility system, which evaluates officials against certain criteria. And of course, discipline. The risk that if you go too far off-piste, if you depart too far from what the centre thinks is permissible, then you may pay a very heavy price, including up to execution, of course. Now, all of these mechanisms have been studied in various different ways, and they all affect the way the system works, but none of them produces total compliance with whatever the top leader appears to want at a given particular moment in time. And that is because the system is actually not designed in that way. The system is designed to be quite experimental and quite permissive, to allow other actors to fill in a lot of the detail. A lot of these things, ideology, top leaders' slogans and things like this, are left incredibly vague. And it is expected that other actors will work out what these things mean in practice. So these other actors can engage in three, what we call the three I's: influencing, interpreting, and ignoring. They can influence all of these things. They can influence all these control measures. They can lobby upwards. They often participate in things like the national legislature or advisory bodies, or they participate in leading small groups, or they use their professional or personal networks to lobby for things that they want to be adopted into national policy frameworks. They engage in interpreting. These frameworks, these slogans, these ideologies, and so on, they're often left incredibly vague. They require interpretation into more detailed action plans. And this is where a lot of actors can inject their own particular interests and say, well, it just so happens that that thing you're now asking us to do, well, it just so happens to coincide with this thing that we want to do. And this is a great way to implement your wishes. You see this very clearly with the Belt and Road Initiative, an article that Jinghang and I wrote together that illustrates how provincial governments were uploading their preferred development initiatives into the Belt and Road policy frameworks. And these initiatives, in some cases, have been going on since the late 1980s. So the idea that this kind of all pops out of the brain of the great leader Xi Jinping is obviously not consistent with reality. And finally, there is the possibility of ignoring. Now, boldly defying the centre and saying, no, we're not going to do what you say. That doesn't happen very often in China because these control mechanisms, particularly this one, is too risky. But there's all kinds of ways, and this is very well documented again in the China studies literature, of foot dragging, of pretending that you're doing something, of claiming that you're doing it but not, or the fact that, for example, with the appraisal system, the cadre responsibility system, you may be tasked, for example, with producing a particular rate of economic growth. At the same time, you're tasked with reducing your consumption of energy. Now, those two things are actually contradictory. So you can prioritize economic growth and not reducing energy consumption in practice because it suits your interest to do so. And then if you are challenged, you can always say, well, look, I'm just following your targets. If you want us to rebalance between those targets, okay, fine, we can do that. And that has happened recently, as we know, in China, when the centre suddenly says, well, there's all these provinces that, we've told you to reduce your energy consumption and, a lot of you don't seem to be doing it. So perhaps you should. 3 months later, these provinces are still not obeying our instructions to reduce energy consumption. 3 months later, okay, now we're really angry. You better reduce your energy consumption. Suddenly, the provincial governments are rationing energy, shutting down power plants, shutting down factories, desperate to show compliance, which shows that these systems, when they're really strongly focused on something that the centre desperately cares about at a particular moment in time, they can elicit really compliant behaviour, or at least great shows of compliance. But what that produces is potentially a swing, dramatic swing from pursuing one kind of agenda to another. And as we've seen, in fact, that sort of kind of resistance from provincial governments has basically led to the government deprioritising China's green energy commitments. So sometimes over-compliance can be used as a way to get the centre to back down on certain issues. So it's not that the centre just says, do this, this, and this, and everybody says, yes, we'll do it. It's much more complicated than that. The centre sets out a broad direction of travel and has these mechanisms to steer and coordinate, but lots of other actors within the system can influence, interpret, and ignore these regulatory guidelines. And so if we want to understand what China does internationally, or rather what I should say is what Chinese actors do internationally, we need to think about the interaction between these coordinating mechanisms and what they're trying to achieve, and how other actors behave within that regulatory framework. Now, our view is that this kind of governance is not really compatible with the idea of pursuing a grand strategy. What grand strategy actually means is very unclear because, as Nina Silo has identified in a very useful survey of the literature, there are at least 3 different main usages of these terms, and they're used very differently. But all of these definitions that she discusses imply having a long-term vision, so knowing what you want to achieve at a particular moment in time, the holistic devotion of state resources, right? This is my particular goal, and I'm going to throw all my resources at this particular objective, and the prioritization of key interests and goals, meaning I want to achieve that, so I'm not going to be able to achieve that. So we're going to deprioritize some issues and prioritize others because I have this long-term strategic objective. Now, our argument is that the Chinese-style regulatory state does not have the kind of coherence, doesn't operate like that. It's too loose. And that's often because, as Lampton comments in 2001, he says the central government may not even know what it wants. It just sets out a vague direction of travel and then lets other people work out where we're going. And lots of examples of this from top leaders' slogans. So Hu Jintao's idea of a harmonious world, vapid slogan, didn't really mean very much at all. Xi Jinping's idea of national rejuvenation. What does that mean really, apart from broadly economic growth and growing military power? The idea of core interest, again, Jing Han has spent a lot of time and effort unpicking what this means, that the central government came out with this idea of core interests, and then it was left to others to work out what these core interests were. And even today, there's considerable disagreement about whether, for example, the South China Sea is a core interest or not. When a state does not even know what its core interests are, then we're not dealing with the strategic unitary state actor of traditional IR theory. Now, the final element of the state transformation approach is that if we want to understand what are the outcomes, like what difference does this behavior actually make in the world? What is the impact on China's actual relations with other countries in the world, on an international order, and so on? We have to understand that China is not unique in being this internally fractured state. All states are to some extent internally fractured, and what we must identify, what we must study, is the interaction of these fragmented social systems. So there are certain interests, agendas emanating from the Chinese party state in a particular issue area, and they interact with a whole set of interests and agendas in other states that are targeted by Chinese initiatives, projects, interventions, etc. And often these initiatives, Chinese policies, are contested in target societies because they're not equally beneficial. They often carry benefits for some groups and costs for others, or potential benefits and costs, and there will often be a struggle over how these benefits and costs should be distributed within partner states. So what we've got to study is the contested, conflict-ridden interaction between the two sides. And we trace outcomes, real-world outcomes, from that interaction, not from some imagined grand strategy that clever people have hatched in Beijing. Now, in the book, we apply this analytical approach to 3 main case studies. And in selecting these cases, first of all, we decided to focus exclusively on Southeast Asia because Southeast Asia is often seen as a laboratory for studying China's rise. Because it is right next to China, it's easy for China to interact with those countries. So Southeast Asia feels the first kind of full force of any policies emanating from China, and that interaction has been very long-term over the course of decades, which means that we can study its effects. So that's one thing. And then the other thing we were interested in was studying different kinds of Chinese policy making. So some issues are to do with security. So South China Sea, for example, is often seen as, this kind of geostrategic conflict, the area where the fate of Sino-US relations is going to be decided. Is China going to play by international law, or is it going to be this aggressive military power? We also wanted to look at other areas of security, so non-traditional security. And we also wanted to look at less kind of what might be described as a low politics area, development cooperation, international development financing. So with that, we looked in particular at hydropower dam development in the Mekong sub-region. But this analysis also we've applied to understanding China's Belt and Road Initiative. But the case that I want to kind of walk you through today, just give you a brief flavour of, is China's efforts to deal with non-traditional security threats in the Southeast Asian region. And in particular, we focus on attempts to deal with the influx of drugs from the Golden Triangle region. And we also, which I won't have time to talk about, we talk about efforts to combat banditry on the Mekong River, so attacks on Chinese shipping down the Mekong River.
Please do talk about the bandits.
Talk about the bandits. I might be able to do that in Q&A, but I won't have time to talk about it in any detail. Sometimes they're called pirates, but here's a fun fact. I'm not sure how fun it is, but it's a fact. Piracy only happens on the high seas. It cannot happen on rivers, because rivers are part of the national territory of particular states. But what's interesting in that case, and in this case, is that China's governance frontier has extended beyond its national borders. China is increasingly reaching into other societies to try to manage issues that are constituted as a threat to Chinese interests. This is very different to the way that China is usually thought about in international relations. China is a Westphalian power. China is addicted to national sovereignty. You know, it's holding up all kinds of international cooperation efforts. It's not true. The Chinese notion of security has transformed along with the Chinese state. As we say in the book, as the Chinese state has become non-traditional, so is its understanding of security. From securing its borders to securing its interests beyond its borders, as those interests have internationalized. So when it comes to drugs, we see that flip, because under Mao, China sealed its borders and viciously suppressed opium cultivation and drug use, with great success within its borders. However, since the reform and opening up process started, China's borders have opened up, and drug trafficking now has penetrated back into China. And that has led to a massive explosion in drug use, particularly in southwest China, and associated public health crises, particularly HIV/AIDS. And so what we see is the securitization of drugs, the identification of these flows into China as a threat to Chinese security, which reflects a broader change in the understanding of security by Chinese policy elites, from a traditional focus on interstate military threats to transnational security threats that easily cross borders. So this discursive securitization came particularly in 2005 when Hu Jintao declared People's War on Drugs. And the way that the Chinese party state has tried to address the influx of heroin and opium into China is to engage in opium substitution projects, OSPs, in states where these drugs are being grown. The idea of opium substitution, it's a very old idea, is you go to the farmers that are growing these drugs and you try to encourage them to grow something else instead, so that they can earn a livelihood growing things that are not narcotics. Now, China has also entered into an international framework that governs efforts to combat the drugs trade in Southeast Asia, called the UN Office on Drugs and Crime Memorandum of Understanding on Drug Control. And through participation in that UN-led system, China has adopted the United Nations principles on what is called alternative development. So opium substitution is a kind of old-fashioned term. The policy wonks at the UN, they prefer the term alternative development, right? It's giving people an alternative so that they can engage in economic development. It means the same thing. But those principles are kind of, nice, kind of liberal principles. Engage in consultation with the farmers, build consent with them, don't impose these projects on them. Make sure that their land holding is secure. Make sure that these alternative development schemes are properly sequenced so that people don't experience poverty. All these kinds of principles. China has adopted these as part of signing up to this regional agreement. Now, not many people have studied this particular policy area, so the literature is quite small, but it all agrees that this has been a fantastic success for China. And that it's very easy to pass that from a realist or liberal perspective. Realists can say, obviously, China is a powerful state, it perceives a security threat, it directs its energies to securing its borders, and it coerces weaker states to comply. Simple. Liberals can also say, well, this is about China signing up to international rules and principles and then implementing those. So China's going to be a status quo power. However, our research, and all of this involves a lot of field work in both China and recipient states, our analysis produces a very different understanding of what was going on here and why. So to begin with, it's not the case that opium substitution projects emerged in the minds of policymakers in Beijing and then were just rolled out in the way that you would expect from a unitary strategic actor. In fact, OSPs are a bottom-up initiative reflecting the decentralization of power and authority in the Chinese party state. The very first OSPs were pushed in the early 1990s by county-level governments in Yunnan province, bordering Myanmar and Laos. So they were actually, those county-level governments were already engaged in opium substitution projects in neighbouring countries. And they lobbied the provincial governments to adopt this as a provincial level policy so they could get more recognition, more policy support, more money, and so on. And the province agreed. And then the province thought, well, we would like more policy support and recognition from Beijing. So Yunnan province lobbied Beijing to accept this as a national policy. And that's what led to this opium substitution projects becoming part of the people's war on drugs. However, at the national level, counter-narcotics policy is an extremely fragmented policy area. There are 41 different agencies that have some kind of responsibility in making and implementing policy in the area of counter-narcotics. The lead agency, the one that tries to coordinate these fractured actors, is the Ministry of Public Security. And the MPS is also the one that has signed up to the UN principles on alternative development, because it is the lead agency in the regional UNODC discussions. So that's supposed to be the regulatory framework for Chinese counter-narcotics. However, when it came to OSPs, a decision was made to bring 21 different agencies together into what was called the 122 work group. And this was led not by the Ministry of Public Security, but by the Ministry of Commerce, MOFCOM. So this shows you how these coordinating agencies can themselves require coordination. They can themselves be quite fragmented. Now, the 122 work group set out regulatory guidance for opium substitution projects. And this is, again, was very, very vague. It set out a broad market-led principles for how this is supposed to work. So basically, it was going to work through lowering taxes on the imports of commodities from these projects and giving subsidies to entities engaged in these projects to go out and find suitable project sites. And it set out broad targets for the coverage, the amount of hectares it wanted to see covered by these projects by a particular time. And that was all. Very little detail, very little operational guidance. The United Nations principles were completely ignored. So the principles that the MPS had signed China up to were ignored by the Ministry of Commerce in setting up the 122 work group. The actual implementation of these OSPs was then decentralized back to Yunnan provincial government, specifically to the Department of Commerce. And that has led to the interpreting of these vague guidelines around the interests of local cadre capitalists. In particular, state-owned or state-linked agribusiness companies operating in Yunnan province. So they have ignored completely the UN and Ministry of Public Security guidelines, and they have essentially hijacked the opium substitution projects. These businesses have become the implementing agencies of the OSPs. It is these businesses that are the ones that go out to foreign countries, find project sites, and try to create alternative development in those countries. It's not government agencies, they are hardly involved. So obviously then what is going on here is a further internationalization of parts of the party state and associated capitalist interests. And their commercial interests trump any strategic rationality. And this is particularly visible when it comes to the selection of the crop that they're going to try and give to the farmers to encourage them to move away from opium. The companies leading the charge, grabbing the subsidies, getting the import tariffs lowered, making money out of this, are rubber companies. Because rubber is a big industry in Yunnan province, and rubber at this particular point in time, which is the late 2000s, early 2010s, is a massive boom crop because there's booming demand in the Chinese automotive sector in particular for rubber, but they're running out of land in southwest China. So, brilliant, this is win-win cooperation, right? Because they get to find land for their agribusiness in neighboring countries. But rubber grows best below 900 meters. It doesn't grow in the mountains. Opium does. Opium is not a lowland crop. Opium needs very high elevation to grow. So you cannot take an opium plantation and replace it with rubber, because rubber will not grow in those areas. So from the very beginning, the strategic interests of these businesses makes it utterly unsuitable for opium substitution. But they are the ones that have hijacked the opium substitution policy. Now, as I said earlier on, we have to look at how these interests emanating from China intersect with interests and agendas on the ground in recipient states. Now, we look in this case study, we look at both Myanmar and Laos, but I'll talk a little bit about Myanmar. The context in Myanmar is a heavily fractured, fragmented, conflict-ridden society, particularly in the borderlands with China, because of long-running ethnic minority insurgencies in the Sino-Myanmar borderlands. So authority in those areas is very much fractured and contested between the military, state officials, militias that are aligned to but not under full control of the military, and ethnic minority armed groups that are independent of the state, some of which are in open rebellion against the central government. And essentially what Chinese agribusinesses did is they found middlemen, Sino-Myanmar businessmen, that could act as a go-between and partner with whoever was in charge in a particular area, so that it could give them access to land. Now, you can see that the people who are in charge of these areas of Myanmar are not very nice people. They rule through the gun. Whether they're from the Myanmar state or whether they're from local militias or rebel groups, these people exercise domination through force, through violence. Therefore, when the Chinese opium substitution projects enter Myanmar, they feed into an epidemic of forced land grabbing by these local partners, leading to the forced displacement of peasant farmers, to forced labour sometimes in the creation of OSP plantations, and to the proletarianisation of peasant farmers who are forced to work as day labourers on these farms. All of this violates the UN principles to which China is ostensibly committed. So all the things that the NPS signed China up to, the opium substitution projects are doing something completely different. Right? These are liberal principles that are being utterly violated on the ground. The outcome of this is that the people involved at the top get very rich. the people that are involved in grabbing the land, in securing these projects, the businesses, the Chinese investors, they get very rich, while the peasant farmers lose out. But this does nothing to help address the drug problem. In fact, opium cultivation actually rises. So if we look at the peak period for these opium substitution projects, which is the decade from around 2004, 2005, we see that actually opium cultivation in Myanmar rises at the same time, it doesn't decrease. The big decreases here, which are highly contested, in fact, have got to do with the army moving against various groups that are laundering, that are growing drugs in Myanmar. In this period, the peak period, it actually rises, which is not that surprising because opium cultivation is strongly correlated with conflict. When there is forced displacement, when there is armed conflict, when people are losing their lands and livelihoods, opium cultivation tends to rise because it is a very quick crop to harvest. Unlike rubber, which takes many years to cultivate and tap, opium you can grow in just a year and it brings in ready cash. So if you're being displaced, if you're desperate, you tend to engage in more opium cultivation, which is why opium cultivation rose, for example, in occupied Afghanistan when NATO went in. And so also then in China, as a result, we see that opium seizures also tend to rise, and so does heroin, the drug that's derived from opium. Short time lag, but it also goes up. So, it's also important to say that this is not, this situation does not change under Xi Jinping. So many people would ask, okay, is your thesis still valid with the rise of Xi Jinping? Because he seems to be in control of everything. He makes all the decisions, he's a chairman of everything. No. What we show in this book is that he is a forceful player of the Chinese-style regulatory state, but he has not fundamentally transformed how China is governed. And in fact, these problems continue under Xi Jinping. It just so happens that the main focus has shifted away from rubber to bananas, because there was a massive crash in the price of rubber, which led to many of these plantations being abandoned and ruined many of the farmers that were engaged in these processes. But the price of bananas went up because there's growing demand for food inside China. So instead of rubber, it's now the Chinese agribusinesses that are involved in producing bananas. And this has led to even more problems under Xi Jinping, because we've seen, because of the kinds of fertilizers and pesticides that are used on rubber plantations, we've seen serious degradation of soil fertility, the poisoning of livestock, and serious health problems among laborers on these farms, particularly the incidence of cancer, because they're using spraying pesticides without any protective equipment. And meantime, the trafficking in amphetamine-type stimulants, which are now by far the most important drug import into China, and you can see is measured by this dotted line here, has risen during this time. So obviously the opium substitution projects have done nothing to suppress this particular form of drug trafficking, and methamphetamine tablets are produced by factories inside Myanmar using chemicals mostly smuggled in from China. So, in short, this is not a success. I think we can see that. It's also very difficult to pass from a liberal or realist perspective, because they cannot account for the internal fracturing of the Chinese party state. They can't see how it works. From a purely strategic perspective, this shouldn't be happening, but it is happening, and it is only explicable through the state transformation approach. Thank you very much. I think I'll open it up to questions.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Lee. I'm just going to keep following you around the room because you're the one wearing the microphone. I'm a
personal stalker.
As always, I have a long list of questions for our presenter, but I can see there's actually a number of hands up in the online chat, which I want to make sure I bring in our online participants Two, are there questions in the room as well? Yeah, a couple, three, okay. All right, then I will not use my chair's prerogative, and I'll take the opportunity to chat to Lee afterwards. Let's go first then to the online chat, and we've got a hand up from J. Wang, Wang Jie, in the Netherlands, I believe. So let me just allow Mike. And yeah, feel free to unmute and ask your question directly, Wang Jie.
Maybe we have to do it.
I think I did.
You have to unmute.
Or unmute. I enabled the microphone. Wang Jie can't unmute herself. So I guess she'll type her question in the chat.
Well, we could make her a presenter. See if that works.
Can't unmute. Okay.
Can you do it now?
I can work on that while we go around the room first, perhaps. Oh, there we go. Okay, we're on.
Hi, yes, I can do that now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks for the presentation. It's excellent. I think many people have tried to explain the seemingly very complicated actions of Chinese domestic actors with a comprehensive framework, but not many has succeeded. So congratulate on your achievement. I look forward to read the book. I haven't done it, but I look forward to reading it. I have two questions. So you've talked about that China is not unique, right? But are there any similarities between these case studies of in your books to show any unique patterns in Chinese actors' approach to foreign affairs? And if there are, how does your framework explain these patterns? So that's the first question. The second question is, has the state attempted to coordinate the domestic actors' actions in any of the issue areas or case studies detailed in your book? If they has attempted to coordinate, then why has it failed?
Shall I address that, or are we taking a few?
I think go ahead. And there's one more that I'll tack on, I think, from the online chat before we go around the room, which is one that I hinted at right at the beginning. This one comes from Yi Chen, postgraduate student, asking about the extent to which these ideas apply domestically. And I think that's related to the fragmented authoritarian literature that you alluded to as being one of the kind of building blocks that you were trying to bridge. But what are you seeing there in terms of China's current domestic politics, and in particular the current situation of pandemic management in Shanghai? Do you see evidence of fragmentation affecting that?
Right, let me address that one first, because that's an easier one. Yes, I think that this is an argument about how the Chinese party state operates in general. And what we're suggesting is that there's not that much difference between the way that it operates domestically and the way that it operates internationally. And that's obviously quite different to the way that most international relations scholars would approach this question, because there's usually seen to be this kind of hermetically sealed area of domestic governance where politics happens, and then the international where strategy and everything's tightly coordinated and controlled by a small foreign policy executive. And I think that's just not necessarily the case. Well, certainly in the cases that we studied, it's not necessarily the case. So when it comes to the management of the pandemic, we do have a short section in the postscript as a postscript to the conclusion where we talk about the pandemic. Now, we were finishing writing this book when the pandemic was happening. We obviously had no ability to go and do field work, and still have no ability to do it now. And I'm not sure I particularly want to be honest. But what you could see already very early on in the pandemic was good, strong evidence that local governments were not following central guidelines and instructions. How do we know? Because the central government said local governments are not following our instructions, right? So there's strong evidence that, the discipline inspection commissions are going into the affected cities and provinces and saying, what the hell, guys?
Unless it's all an elaborate plan to deceive the world as part of a 100-year marathon.
Well, yes, there's always that possibility that, it's a biological weapon unleashed on the world, etc., etc. But, the Chinese obviously have developed quite ostensibly quite robust approach to pandemic management after the SARS fiasco, 2003-04. But this obviously just didn't work very well. Which kind of goes to the question about, are there attempts to coordinate? Yes, of course there are attempts to coordinate, but they're not necessarily effective. So clearly there was a failure of these systems at the beginning. And then I think it became what's, I forget the name of the particular Chinese scholar, but they call it a spotlight issue. And I think that's quite a nice metaphor, that with a spotlight, you can really focus light and attention on particular issues, that issue or that issue. And when that happens, when you bring those coordinating mechanisms to bear on a particular issue area or a particular part of the country or whatever it is, then there's if you're in the glare of that spotlight, it's very uncomfortable. So people were subject to disciplinaries, they were removed from their posts, they were thrown into prison, etc., etc. And that then gave, I think, a lot of incentive on the part of local cadres to be clearly then following central directives and procedures. But the thing about a spotlight is it's not a floodlight. It can't work all the time. It only works on particular issue areas. And while you're focused on that, you're not focused on something else either. So you can bring those coordinating mechanisms to bear, but only for particular issues and a particular time span. You can't approximate total control of everything. That's just not how, I think not how any state works, but it's certainly not how the Chinese party state works. Now, I think under those circumstances, that's when you start to get sort of tighter coordination and tighter, less deviation, if you like. But still, I think, and I can only surmise this really, I don't believe the figures that are reported for pandemic control in China. I think they're just not credible. So somebody is not telling the truth. I think it's also the case that given that you've got contradictory guidelines, contradictory objectives, maintain economic growth, look after the people and suppress COVID, these things are contradictory. You cannot have an insane policy of zero COVID and hope to maintain social and economic welfare. Those two things are contradictory because zero COVID entails lockdowns, which are severely harmful for many people and certainly for economic growth. So I would expect, and I believe you would find if you looked closely enough, plenty of sort of quiet non-compliance with the strictest measures, and then maybe like very strong compliance when things maybe get out of hand. But in some areas, you get kind of hysterical over-compliance. So Hong Kong, for example, is engaged in hysterical over-compliance on zero COVID because the leaders there have a very strong incentive to robotically follow whatever orders are coming down from Beijing in order to demonstrate their loyalty and to suppress, obviously, the various uprisings that have happened in Hong Kong and to basically subordinate Hong Kong to Beijing's authority. So the policy there is literally insane. Forbidding people to go out in groups of more than two, slaughtering hamsters because one hamster is found to have caught COVID, etc. So hysterical over-compliance in Hong Kong and maybe under-compliance in other areas. That is my guess. However, I have not done the detailed work and detailed field work, and obviously it's not possible for me to do so. But I think there's enough evidence to show that those kind of dynamics are visible in the pandemic. And then Dre's question. So the attempts to coordinate. So yes, I mentioned at the beginning, there are 5 different coordinating mechanisms that the centre uses, and it uses these all the time, routinely. But they don't always function very effectively. So in the case study that I just presented, The 122 work group was the coordinating mechanism, but obviously didn't work very well. It did certainly produce the outcomes that the policy was ostensibly designed to produce. So what we do in the book is we suggest that the application and efficacy of coordinating mechanisms is something that varies, and it can vary from low to high. So sometimes maybe coordinating mechanisms are not used, sometimes maybe they're just not very efficacious. So spotlight issues would be, high, and then maybe the OSPs would be low. And this is something that can change over time. And then the other thing that we thought was important, and this is inductively generated out of our cases, this is something that appears in the conclusion of the book. The other thing that we think is important is the alignment of interests. The alignment of interest between powerful groups within the party state. So again, that can be low or it can be high. So in areas where you've got low application and efficacy of coordinating mechanisms and low alignment of interests, i.e. there is disalignment of interest, that's when you're going to see highly inconsistent, erratic, contradictory behaviour that's difficult to make sense of. In areas where mechanisms are very strong, maybe, or the alignment of interest is very high, that's when China will appear to look more like a unitary actor. But these things can also change over time. So for example, if you've got low alignment of interests, and that starts to produce erratic behaviour, maybe the centre will start to tighten up coordination or try to rein in actors. So you can get a particular issue area, like say South China Sea, and it can move potentially over time from a situation of low alignment of interests and low efficacy and coordination mechanism, potentially it moves, that the coordination mechanism may become tighter over time. So you can potentially move quadrants over time. The crucial thing is this is not about issue area. This is what we thought might be the case, that maybe certain issue areas, maybe that's where there'll be like less fragmentation and more coordination. It's not what we found. It's not like high politics is really tightly coordinated and then low politics is not, or something like that. That's not the case. The things that we found that were important was how much the centre is trying to coordinate and control, how tightly does it define the policy envelope, like you're allowed to do this and no more than this. And some areas they might define it very, very tightly. And whether there are different interests that are kind of pushing and pulling, right, stretching that policy envelope, breaking out of that policy envelope, or not. Those are the two things that we thought were important. And then the first question was there any unique patterns in Chinese behaviour? And that's a difficult one for me to answer because, of course, this is not a comparative study. But the framework is framed in such a way that it allows for comparative study. And in a 2019 special issue of Third World Quarterly, which I co-edited, people applied this framework to a number of different sort of middle or rising powers, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, India, and so on. And what you find is that this is a quite useful explanatory framework, but it is explicitly a mid-range framework. We're saying these are general processes, and you can apply these to many, many different cases, but what you will find will vary quite substantially because each state-society complex, from a Gramscian perspective, is special. It has particular features. So this is a framework that allows you to plug in those particular features. And I would hope that others will do more kind of comparative work over time, but it's not something that I have yet undertaken.
Lee, I saw Jing Han's hand go up first, and there's at least two more around the room. Can I ask you to literally go around the room so that you're standing somewhat near to the person who's asking the question for the benefit of the online audience? You just wander around.
I will, okay. I feel like a game show host. But obviously it's much less glamorous.
Right, okay, so should I be speaking? Okay, so fantastic talk and very good book. I'm glad that, we will talk about it, I'll come back to the previous, some of my thoughts on on state transformation. But the more I think about it, and also the question I'm having in my mind, also sometimes I find there is a struggle between my identity as a China expert and identity as an IR expert. And I think that's a problem. That's a problem we have to address here, right? So we talk about how China literature hasn't been addressing theory enough. That's why I'm leaving the gap here. But then I think I have a few questions regarding that. First of all, you mentioned China is, I mean, the coordination is very poor in many ways. But then when you look at COVID, can you name another government which is better than the Chinese government in coordinating COVID? And if Chinese government is no longer a military, unilateral actor, any government in the world should be, or probably I thinking about North Korean. And then that leads to a wider question. If the Chinese government cannot do it, nobody else can do it, is there any grand strategy at all? Or probably the term per se of grand strategy is a fantasy of international relation that's talking about something that do not exist at all. So if we're addressing the matter, and then a second question with that is, the more I look into the China's case, the more I feel, for example, the central leader do not necessarily know what they want. The sub-national local actor trying to interpret and benefit themselves. That's not unique in China. That's the same here in the UK, in America. Isn't that a natural process of policy making? And how make America great again or pivot to Asia is a clear US strategy. I don't see it. So from the public policy expert perspective, what's happening now is perfectly normal. So from that perspective again, what has been discussed in international relations literature or how China has been doing this and that is again the illusion that do not exist at all in this world. So if you follow that, then China expert would be saying, why shall we engage with international relations literature? They only notice China because China is rising, and they create all the illusion of, of China is doing this and that. And why shall we talk to those people? What's the obligation of China experts or China studies community to engage with them if they are perceived as the one who don't really understand China and has been creating all those kind of illusions? I think those are the questions in my head. Obviously, I'm in politics department, so it's my responsibility to engage with IR literature. But some of my colleagues, not necessarily doing IR, might ask this question. So I wonder how you think about this.
You can probably just continue where it was picking it up quite nicely, just as long as you're in the general area. Yeah. As long as it's not bursting their eardrums.
Thanks very much. That was a great talk. And, I suppose I am a sinologist, and but not one who's really dabbled much in politics. But my reflection to your talk is, if we were all sitting here in pre-1949 and you presented a talk on fractured, fragmented China, I would say, well, what's new about this? And so, is there a way of looking at this that sees the Mao years and high socialism and the command and control structure that you set out as more the exception rather than the rule or the norm? And that what we're seeing now is more of a kind of reversion to type, although clearly there are new circumstances and different ways in which the economy and politics are being organised, but more or less a kind of reversion to fragmentation and fracturing. And for me, I think if we were to try to identify a grand strategy in the context of Chinese political environment, it would be for in the absence of democratic elections, it would be for the leader and the party to stay in power. And that seems to me to be the number one goal, at least. And then the other kind of outcome objectives that are around might feed into that, like social stability and so on, overtaking the US and whatnot. But the primary goal would be to stay in power, and then the party would adopt appropriate contextual strategies and tactics to enable it to do that. And one of the ways in which it does that, and historically what we've seen in China, are loose laws that you've referred to. And loose laws presumably serve the purposes of non-democratic governments because they can then interpret them as they wish, and they can't really be used against those in power. So, are we not then seeing a situation where, for example, the narcotics things that you were explaining in detail, which was fascinating, that when they do not threaten the power of the ruling party, then they can be tolerated, and it's when they become potentially threatening to the legitimacy or the power or the hold of the party that then the centre needs to take specific action. So that's my opinion.
Right behind you.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting and I learned a lot about it. According to your presentation, I just think of a term proposed by a famous scholar, Qin Hui. He talked about the no human rights developing mode in China, and he also talked some Western countries are also affected by it. So my question is about how the state transformation approach affect other countries' developing strategies.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk, so well, thank you. I thought I detected a slight tension maybe between two different frameworks you were sketching out. One was that you have kind of a drift from this Maoist period where there was a centralized unitary state to now where you have this regulated state that's more internationalized. But there was another kind of framework which is that inherently there's always a kind of entropic drift in any kind of state, any kind of institution. There's going to be kind of sprawl and drift and sheer corruption. So you have a kind of tension between the state building, institution building dynamic and then the kind of inherent entropic aspect. So they're always kind of drifting back and forward and kind of, it's kind of more universal tension maybe. So it's which of those do you think is more accurate? Is something about the nature of the Maoist state compared to the regulated state, which is inherently has different abilities of control, or is it more of a universal tension? And my specific question was about corruption and the Xi Jinping. So one of the things I heard anecdotally is that Xi Jinping has been successful in cracking down corruption in a way that the Jutao wasn't. That he's actually been maintaining it for years now, whereas previous rounds of corruption, they would come and go, and then within a few months you would be kind of back to the ball. There's been a kind of really quite meaningful change since Xi Jinping came to power to cracking down on that. And if so, where does that fit into this idea of Xi Jinping as being the same as being the same as before? Thank you.
Are these set of provocations?
That's a loss.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, I'll try to answer some of these together.
Got about 8 minutes to do it. 2 minutes per provocation.
So that means that I have a license, therefore, to be crude in my answers. So, I mean, try to address some of the questions about, is it kind of back to the future, reversion? Is there anything different about China? Why should we, has it always been like this, or isn't it, whatever? The way that I would see it, broadly speaking, is that you can see the formation of states, what you call state building, right? So that means the attempt to create a strong central authority that has this kind of command and control way to organise actors within the state and within the economy. That is a project, and it's a project that's quite widespread, particularly after the Second World War. But you can see in European states that attempt to cohere states, to create central authorities that have this capacity. That's something that we see from the late 19th century onwards in certain European states, and we certainly see it after the Second World War in all Western states to some extent, and of course also in post-colonial states, the project of the developmental state. So you get a kind of coming together, if you like, a kind of harnessing of different productive forces that then kind of come together in what we understand to be the nation state after the Second World War for a few decades. And that's the period, the heyday of the modern nation state, in which the IR theories that dominate our discipline were formed. And that leaves a massive intellectual imprint on the field, because it's mostly a post-war field. And then that's the kind of intellectual framework you're forced to operate within, even as you're critiquing it. Right? Everybody sort of takes their cue basically from Kenneth Waltz, right? You're either with him or you're against him in some way. And Waltz is writing just before the nation state starts to unravel with the turn to neoliberalism in the late 1970s. So what I would suggest is that there's that pulling together, and then there's that dissolution, new forms of governance emerging. So that's why you see a more generalized shift from the command and control state to the regulatory state, not merely in China, but across the world, with, of course, lots of local variation, etc. So the consequence of that is it's not unique to China, and lots of other states don't behave in a way that IR theory thinks either. Right? That's not the argument in the book. The argument in the book is that we need to understand China like we understand any other state, but with a mid-range theory that you can plug in the local particularities. So from that perspective, understanding things through a grand strategy framework might have had more purchase on reality at a particular point in time, but not because the theory was correct, but just that the theory happened to map onto reality at a particular moment in time. But reality keeps developing, and the theory becomes less and less tractable. It's less and less true, if you like. So then we can't explain things like the end of the Cold War and globalization and et cetera, right? Things start to not match onto the theory. Whereas a theory that understands the state as conflict-ridden, as kind of only ever tendentially unitary and so on, that studies that process of cohering and then dissolution and then how do you control things, you can tell that story over time. You're not bound to a particular time where the state is more or less fragmentary. You just trace it historically. And what I would emphasize is that we have not gone back to a pre-Maoist time in China because history doesn't repeat itself. The China of today is moved away from a powerful command economy, right? We didn't have state-owned enterprises in 19th century China that are kind of major global actors. So we've not gone back to that period of fragmentation. Not like we've gone back to the warring states period or something like that, obviously not. So we're dealing with the transformation of a system that has accrued over time. And so that historical approach is absolutely fundamental to a Gramscian analysis. Why then should you engage in IR theory? It is unfortunately the case that IR theory is very influential. It's in people's heads. This is what I say to my students. Why we must study IR theory is that people operate with this in their heads. I engage with UK policymakers a lot. They'll have some version of some IR theory operating in their heads. So you have to engage in these kinds of discussions, otherwise policy discussions are going to be dominated by these kinds of people, right? This is the guy that's advising Biden on China. So if you don't, as a China expert, engage, then it's dangerous for the world. It's maybe too late, that's my worry, but there's a responsibility of anybody that has understanding of the world, no matter what that understanding is. There's a responsibility that you have as a scholar to try to educate and enlighten and engage with people outside of the academy. So that's why. On your point about staying in power, I agree that that's the fundamental goal of the CCP, but that's generally the goal of any political elite, almost. But that doesn't tell you that much, because you can stay in power by doing all kinds of different things. So you've got to look at the specificities. What are the means by which they look to stay in power? And similarly with the red lines, I agree that anything that crosses that red line of threatening CCP rule, that's when you can guarantee the centre will come down. But there are other red lines, it's not only that one. So I would agree with you fundamentally, but I think it's not a very sort of detailed guide as to state behaviour, just wanting to stay in power. And also some regimes don't stay in power. You know, if you thought that was the fundamental, or they don't manage to stay in power. So you think about Gorbachev, you know, he didn't set out to destroy the Soviet Union, but that was That was the result of his policies. You think about the apartheid regime in South Africa, they didn't preserve their regime. So sometimes even regimes themselves don't seem to pursue that goal. So even that as a sort of rational actor kind of model, even that doesn't necessarily work. On the question about STA and other countries' development strategies, again, I can't really answer that because I haven't studied any other countries in sufficient detail. So I'm afraid I can't really answer it, but other countries would certainly be affected in this way. And I think if you look at the UK's levelling up white paper, for example, what you see there is a remarkable decentralisation of responsibility, because the approach there, what this country needs is a centralised industrial policy that would do something, for example, to uplift the north, right? As a northerner, every time I come back to the north, I'm dismayed by the state of the post-industrial north, because the state abandoned its responsibility for the social and economic development of so many areas in this country. And there are consequences to that, not least the 2016 Brexit vote. But what's the government's response with levelling up? We'll create lots of local mayors and they can work it out. So in that sense of not having a centrally defined development strategy, I think is certainly the case here. There are lots of sort of broad regulatory outlines, and then it's left to others to solve the problems. It's not too dissimilar, but it's a lot less successful. And then finally, the question about anti-corruption is this. The CCP powers of discipline. It's the Central Commission Discipline Inspection Commission that has handled this, and he has prioritised that. And it is for these reasons about wanting to stay in power, that by the time she comes to power, the CCP is so corrupt because of these, because of the development of the capitalist class, it produces an existential threat to the CCP, right? But still, that is happening within certain limits. So some people fall, some people don't. Still now, they're still rooting people out. Lots and lots of, well over 1 million local level cadres have been prosecuted and so on. Some quite high level people, not too many. So still there are political limits to the extent to which you can drive out corruption. There's lots of evidence that Xi's own family, that former Premier Wen's family have become mysteriously extremely rich. But of course, that commission is not bearing down on those people. So those, I think, are the particular reasons why corruption has been lent on so hard. It is about kind of recohering the regime, kind of remoralizing it and trying to re-legitimize it in the eyes of the Chinese people. I think I covered everything, but if I didn't, then apologies.